everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Herd Con's Book Chats, where we talk about books. And this is part of our horror season of horror. And today we'll be talking about Man-Made Monsters by Andrea L. Rogers. And of course, with me today is Meghan Sexton-Harness. We are the hosts of this show, obviously. And before we get started, we have to do those important disclaimers. So I want to read it exactly. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of Marshall University Libraries, the Department of English, the College of Liberal Arts, or Herd Con. But we do thank them for giving us a job. Meghan, you've got a little introduction for Andrea L. Rogers.
Sure. She actually very nicely writes her own bios in her press kit if we want to use those. And I felt like, especially where she comes from, an indigenous nation, I wanted to make sure that she was introduced the way she wanted to be introduced.
Yes. And you are properly citing the source here.
Yes. So Andrea L. Rogers is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but currently lives in Arkansas. She graduated with an MFA from the Institute for American Indian Arts. Her literary horror and speculative fiction stories have been published in Waxwing, Yellow Medicine Review, the Santa Fe Literary Review, Transmotion, the Massachusetts Review, and River Styx. Capstone published her children's book, Mary and the Trail of Tears, which was included on the Best Books of 2020 by both NPR and American Indians in Children's Literature. Her essay, My Oklahoma History, appeared in U2, 25 Voices shared their Me Too stories from Inkyard Press. Her short story, The Ballad of Maggie Wilson, is included in Intertribal Stories for Kids, an MG short story. Anthology from Heartdrum, an imprint of HarperCollins, which was released on February 9th, 2021. And then her picture book, When We Gather, for Heartdrum, was released. Sorry, this is a little outdated. Will be out May 7th of 2024. And it is a story about community and wild onion dinners. So apparently Man-Made Monsters was not in the works when this was written. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a book that's also something that reflects on a lot of things from the past with the Cherokee, and is if you've got to the last story of the book, very very current to our recent experiences, which many seem to have amnesia about, and don't seem to forget about things like pandemics and stuff like that. Which kind of the last story ends on a pandemic.
My favorite kind of pandemic.
No. Yes. It's a more, I don't know. It's a hopeful pandemic, I suppose. So yeah, to give just kind of a little summary of this book, and is it Andrea Rogers or Andrea? I don't know. We should probably pick a word. Andrea sounds fine. And I hate to. I'm really bad. I like to tell my students that I'm like. Is it Andrea? Is it Andrea? But now I'm like, is it Andrea? And I'm like, oh no, all three of them. Who? So it's always been a tough one for me.
Agreed.
So, yeah, we can see this very much as this is an example of in an earlier episode we did an episode of Crystal Wilkinson's Water Street, and that was a short story cycle or a novel in stories, and this also is that, but it uses a kind of different setup. It basically goes from what was it, about the 18, let me just double check here. Starts with the 1839 and goes to 2000. So it's 200 years actually. I just realized that. So it's a 200-year history of an extended Cherokee family going through various key events through the world of social media and into the future. Actually, so I guess this has, obviously it has the aspect of folktale, of legend, of Cherokee stories. It embodies fairy tales, certainly in a lot of places, and horror, and I guess it gets a little science fiction in there too. So she very much covers a lot of the genres.
Yeah, I think that she did a really interesting way of compacting so many horror conventions,
Hmm.
but also playing with the horror conventions. Um, it might be the era that I grew up in, but when I was reading the first story, I was like, oh, Twilight,
Hmm.
because obviously I grew up. That was the thing around then. But then it was so different. There seemed to be a religious aspect to these vampires. They would draw the crosses, and I didn't. It made me interested in, is this Cherokee specific vampire lore, or is this her lore that she's
Hmm.
imagined?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems. I mean, oddly enough, it seems like a very hybrid, mixed kind of uh, just a amalgamation of different stories and myths that are placed in there. Even there's one story about Deer Woman, and there's a part in it where the main character, her mother, says she didn't know about Deer Woman until she was like 25, and it was people that she went to different people from different tribes that she went to school with that she found out about it on the internet. So that this like, and I think it's important to remember is that in America, where there were many indigenous tribes, there were a lot of different ones, and they had different belief systems, and they had different ways of living, and they had all these different things about them. So it's hard to kind of you can't fall into the stereotypical this is what a Native American is, and so there's a lot of variation, just depending on the environment they lived in, their culture, and all those things. Go
Um,
ahead.
yeah, I did appreciate that a lot of them, and I guess because it is written by a Cherokee person, they didn't have what white people would name um, Indigenous Americans. They didn't, whether those are traditionally correct or not. We didn't have that, but also we did still have like these streams of ideas. Like it wasn't just Native American women who were being fetishized. We see that with the men as well,
Hmm.
and how the white women, once they realize that they don't want to live like the nation lives, that they run back away to east.
Hmm.
That's a very it popped up over and over and over again throughout the story.
Yeah, I think that can. I mean, just throughout, thinking about themes running throughout the stories is this sense of. I think generally, there's certain characters, usually circumstances of becoming a vampire or a werewolf. Fill in what metaphor you may, and they have to leave. They have to leave the homeland, which the homeland for them is Oklahoma. Uh, or they're vampires, and vampires have a very heavy network of territories in one particular story, and you can only you have to get special permission to go to a different territory or something like that. So
While we're on the topic of vampires, I found the first story, at least from my experience, I was also thinking like of Thanksgiving
hmm.
because the main characters are they're sharing with this man who's randomly shown up, even though they don't know if he's with the cavalry. He doesn't give them much, and then he infects them.
Yeah.
And so I was like, is this a smallpox parallel? Is this like biological warfare? Like, what are obviously we are talking about colonization,
Hmm.
but like when we think of vampires, what are we connecting it to?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one that starts in Texas, oddly. And one thing to clarify, I know we're recording from West Virginia, and we're in Appalachia, and there are two distinct bands of the Cherokee. There's the Eastern band that's in Western North Carolina and the Qualla boundary, and they were just really a small population that hid out in the mountains while the rest of the Cherokee were forced into the what would be called the Indian territories, before it became Oklahoma. And the majority of them went west to Oklahoma. So the larger population band is the Western band. And it seems in the opening story they get kind of moved around, and they're in Texas. And yeah, these seemingly friendly, ruthless vampires catch them and drink their blood and do all these kind of awful things to them. And I tend to think of it like that. Well, you kind of the modern sense of you have that there is a certain vitality and spirit to indigenous peoples that white folks want to tap and take. And to me, that's what it feels more like. I mean, that's vampire is taking this authenticity
Sure.
from them.
That absolutely makes sense as well.
And also there also that infection through line, which is obviously something that very much happened to all indigenous people in the Americas with smallpox.
But that first story also brought me to one of my issues, and this is, I think, just a personal preference of mine. I cannot stand open-ended stories.
Oh, you can't?
No, like when we were learning Greek mythology and you got the story about the thief and the lion and the woman, I hated that story. It made me so irritated every time. But this book is different. It does have those open endings, but because they have those family trees at the beginning, we can still kind of track who survived in these stories. Like in the first story, when I was reading it, I assumed the brother and both the sister were killed. But if we look at the family tree, they actually went on to marry and have children. So I really think that having the family tree there kind of finishes those stories for you. They feel open-ended, but then if you glance back, you see they're not.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mind open-ended story. I do think it gives you I think that story gives you a strong sense of where everything's going. And it's interesting. There's the character of Amma is vampirized and made a vampire, and she's sensitive to the light and all this stuff. And then, hundreds of years later, she shows back up to kind of wrap the story up. She's still hanging around. There's a story. The story I came from the water. There's a water alien of some sort that she helped. They just know each other. Like we're both supernatural creatures, and she helps them out. And then that I think it makes for a nice bookend because in that story, she talks about how much she failed, the failure to help her family, and now after 200 years and being a vampire, being a badass vampire, she can help the people that she needs to help out. She can kill who needs killing, and she can save who needs saving.
Absolutely. Though the water alien. So I'll admit, as I was reading this, I was flying through the shorter ones. I just prefer short chapters. It helps with my attention span. And I got to the long one, and I was like, oh gosh, it ended up being one of my favorites. It was so worth it. I cried several times within like the 50 ebook pages that it was.
Yeah, you're talking about I Come From Water.
Yes, yeah. It Come From Water. It's about the dad dying, which already makes me very emotional. But then you have that beautiful coming out scene where it's not just a daughter coming out to a mother, it's a mother coming out to a Oh my gosh, I cried so hard.
Andrea, maybe my eyes moisturized a little bit, but I do understand the certainly the sentiment, but also it's the kind of humor of it all. It's like the point where, a daughter is going to be vulnerable, and then it's almost like her mom wants to top her at that point. But everybody's like, oh, we're okay with this,
I actually laughed out loud and stopped to read to my partners when the mom says, oh, you found out you were gay on an internet quiz? And then she's like, oh, and I have a crush on my best friend. Yeah. And it's like, oh, okay. It wasn't just an internet quiz that told you were gay.
Yeah.
Just that whole moment, it did make me very emotional. But then you did have that humor breaking it up. I thought I kept waiting for the shoe to drop in that story for something bad to happen. And it doesn't.
It's a lot of, I would say it's a depressing story
for sure
in so many ways, and there's so much grief in it. The alien who is an alien from some planet named Oceania, and that was not the original planet they were from. So it's got this kind of, man who fell to Earth or something like that, and he's just voyaging across to find a place where a nice watery, salty place where they can hang out. And he ends up in Oklahoma. So
Crashlands.
Pretty landlocked. There's the lake that I lived in Nebraska for a number of years, but I always like that they mentioned. Oh, it used to be the ocean floor in that part. It's like a low, shallow sea, and that's why you can find all these really interesting fossils there that would be nowhere near. That would be in the ocean. But it is. I think in a lot of ways it's like a story about all of these characters being so out of place in it. Because in that story, You have that they're away from family, they're away from there's the sense of the need to connection, to be connected to family, to friends, to the people that they are, to other Cherokee.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like, you also have, like, the rejection. We find out that the little girl who has a crush on her best friend is no longer best friends because the girl didn't like that she was gay and outed her.
Mm-hmm.
And now she has no friends, so feels like there's nowhere she belongs.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, you have this very beautiful, they're watching the sunset across the ocean. There was a quote in that one that I wrote down. It's the only quote from the book I wrote down because it hit me so hard when I read it. It was, "Home was what I lost when I lost my father. My mother and I have been homesick ever since."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that what a beautiful way to look at grief,
Mm-hmm.
especially if we go back to, like, home is where the heart is.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was beautiful to think of grief as homesickness.
Mm-hmm. And so much with these stories about displacement. I mean,
Yes.
obviously with the Eastern tribes, the Cherokee and others being forcibly removed to Oklahoma, but also fun historical fact, they had set up a really good education system, a good government. The people in the Cherokee Nation that were living some of the highest quality of life in the United States, although they did have slaves. They did have enslaved people. And that's what's referred to as a freedman Cherokee because they grew up in the culture. They are something that happened. They were considered Cherokee. But yeah, there was that. But also their reservation. There's a part in the story where I can't remember which story, but it talks about the reservations were taken from them, and then there was another just a constant breaking and ripping apart where a number of the Cherokee Nation's trying to set down roots, and characters are trying to set down roots. It's just all sort of, there's a lot of shiftiness around the region where the stories take place.
Or I know one of the stories talks about how cheaply they were able to lease land from them because they were desperate. Like, the Native Americans were desperate to hold on to theirs. So if leasing this to you for cheap would help me hold on to more of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more the way that they were exploited. They were given land, but that doesn't mean anything if they weren't given the other resources back.
Yeah. And another fun fact about Indian reservations in America is the one thing to remember about reservations is that the land is owned collectively, so it's hard for any, say, a Native American person to start a small business. Where do you get where does the collateral for the loan come from? And it was bad where white people could make homestead claims in reservations if the land wasn't being used. And so this all of just, this is the places they have, things that are negotiated by treaty, and then already just the constant, let's take a little more and a little more and a little more, just wherever we can chisel away from this culture and this community.
I've already brought up Twilight. So while we're having this conversation, I think of King of the Hill, where John Redcorn, the Native American character, gets talked into opening a casino by Native Americans who then try to steal his land because it's illegal to own a casino in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of those types of tactics.
Yeah.
Of taking the land out from under them through those sneaky back doors and, like, the legal system.
Yeah. It's a little too like totally different. It's all of this like fracking when people some people like have fracking claim, like they signed leases to get natural gas removed via fracking from their land, and oftentimes it's like, well, we gotta make sure we make a profit, so they literally send them minuscule checks or no checks at all. Like the check is like for $0 because it cost all this money to get that, and the price of natural gas is very it goes up and down, but that kind of manipulation and trickery, you see that throughout.
I mean, it's because if you have to take them to court, who's the court going to side with?
Yeah. I don't recall a casino in these books, which some are better than others.
I like to think that highlights the difference of the way that white creators talk about Native Americans and the way they live versus the way Native Americans talk about what's important to them.
Yeah.
Like it very much highlights those differences.
Yeah. And I think too, it really, I mean, I think if anything, it shows also the commonalities with, the other folks in the country. They like pop culture. They like horror movies. They enjoy a good pop culture reference. We're all not that different. There's a lot. I mean, there's things that I think if you are a non-native reader, I think you could certainly connect with and relate to in a lot of ways. Relationships, family. I mean, yeah, some of this stuff feels like, oh, these are people I've known before in my life.
For sure. And I was surprised while I was researching before the podcast, just seeing what other people had to say about the book, that several people were like, I don't understand how this is a YA book. And I thought to myself, if this was written by a white person, I can't see that you would say the same. There's nothing in this book. There's no sexual contact. There is nothing in this book that would deem it not YA.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just very apprehensive about why this book of all would be, why is it labeled YA?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't necessarily feel you could put this in the fiction section and you could put this in the YA section. It seems like, I mean, also like YA has they have some really awful stuff. And, there's plenty of dark stuff in YA books. I don't know, sometimes I know that there are, and I knew people I knew in college, won't say any names, but they wrote their books as this is a work of literature, and then they're like, you could publish it at YA and sell a lot more copies. So I think that happens a lot, and I think this is her first YA book, although she had done children's books and a variety of other things. Definitely dabbling in very different genres and for very different age groups. But yeah, sometimes I think sometimes that's more than anything else. I think that's a publisher thing, is what they think. Who's gonna buy the most copies?
See, for me, it's who the main protagonist is a lot of the times. Like almost every story in this book, it's a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that is kind of like the YA thing. It's the coming of age still. Those are who we're focusing on.
Yeah. So like Game of Thrones then, with all the kid protagonists in it.
I can't tell you anything about Game of Thrones.
There's a lot of very young characters in that book, but we never think of it as YA.
A little too rapey for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's very violent.
I was very relieved that none of that happened in this book.
Yeah.
Because that was another thing that I was like, okay, is this because it did happen.
Mm-hmm. We certainly see lots of interactions of abuse,
For sure.
and I think it's one of the story. One. Remember that story was it? The one before the last ones, but it wasn't Dear Woman. It was the one before Dear Woman. I think it was Happily Ever After. Yeah, which is one that doesn't have any fantastical. Yeah, is that it doesn't have any It has some kind of fantastical elements, but it's all pretty. It's. I think it's the most realistic of the stories.
Can you refresh my memory?
That's the one where it's Riley, and he wants to make sure that his sister has the perfect.
The robot perfect boyfriend. Okay.
Yeah, which was really his perfect boyfriend. He was like basically making his ideal man, and so I guess that's a way of him for coming out.
I was so relieved for her when her friend and her boyfriend took out the trash themselves.
Yeah,
that was the best outcome.
Broken people find broken people is what I've heard recently. But yeah, that one doesn't have any. I think aside from a little whimsy at the end, it doesn't really have any sort of supernatural thing. But there's a character named Jordan that is kind of ends up dating the narrator and is just a terrible human being, and is like early stage terrible human. There's a moment where she tries to break up with him, and then he hits her, and then he feels very awful and says it'll never happen again. So he love bombs him, and I think in like a very like practical dread, I just like dreading
yes
any sort of interaction with this guy. And then her friend, who's a friend of happenstance, which I've always heard this like when like parents who have best friends and they have a kid. I don't know if this is an experience you've had, but do you remember like that they try to like, okay, go hang out with our dear friend's child? Or
I had
anything?
cousins. Does that
You
count?
have cousins. I mean, yeah, we feel like okay, you're all relatively the same age, so you've got to hang out.
That's probably the closest I came. My
Mhm.
mom had me very young, so she didn't really have time for friends until
Mhm.
later in my life. And then by then, all of her friends had kids much younger than me.
Oh yeah,
So luckily, I got to skip that one. But I had plenty of cousins I didn't want to be around.
yeah. I guess it was like I didn't have anybody's like, oh, I can't stand. There was like one kid I remember. I didn't like him very much. I don't think we liked each other and we didn't want to hang around each other. But it didn't develop into this multi-decade kind of like, I guess we're friends kind of thing. And it just feels the whole thing. It feels the most toxic thing that of all the stories. And there's some dark stories here.
That one was the one that filled me with the most dread.
Yeah.
And I think because it was so realistic. If the title "Man-Made Monsters," this is the story.
Yeah.
This is the man monster. It's not a vampire hurting her. It's not a werewolf. It's not it's not a zombie. It's just a white boy.
Yeah. And it ends happy. The family gets the dad who's grieving and going through a lot of things with the death of the mother, and they kind of they have a nice little moment. And I think there was one part where they talked about watching it's a horror movie. The movie Blood Quantum, is that the one? It's a horror movie. It's a Native American horror movie. I haven't seen it yet.
I want to say I know exactly what the cover looks like,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if I can say I've seen it. I think that it's
It's like a
zombie movie.
yeah. It's a guy with like a mask.
Yeah.
And he's like
And it's like red and orange.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's a Native American zombie movie. I think it's like that. Yeah, Blood Quantum. That the Native Americans are somewhat resistant to zombies, or they are resistant to zombies, and so that a lot of people want to the places they have built. Other people want to break into their like towns and fortresses and things like that. So yet again, we see a perpetuation of hey, let's take the native people's lands in some fashion.
I do find it interesting. The last story. There's another one I want to come back to, but the main last story is a zombie apocalypse. Which now, looking at the fact that they mentioned Blood Quantum, kind of feels like foreshadowing of where we're going.
Yeah.
But in it, one, I thought it was interesting that there were so many references to The Shining, because we know the mom fled an abusive husband, but she was still obsessed with The Shining. And when I think of that movie, the first thing that stands out to me is all of the Native American designs in that hotel.
Yeah.
And like that, they're profiting off of that vibe. So that was my first thought when she kept bringing up The Shining. But second, I wanted. I'm a zombie.
Yeah,
lover.
I know you love the zombies.
So
it's okay.
I was very confused about like the zombie stuff there because the sister was never bitten. She died in an asthma attack. But if this is a flu, how did the sister turn into a zombie? I was very like trying to figure, and I was like, so are these Walking Dead zombies where we're all infected?
Yes, that's it. That makes the easiest. She got the zombie flu and died, and her body was weak, and then she came back and killed her mom, and then Ama from 200 years ago shows back up to clean up everybody's mess. So.
But I loved that because it was the tribal lands. They had rebuilt this community.
Yeah.
And I loved that idea that they were inviting anybody, come to our drive-in, just bring us canned food or whatever you can bring.
Yeah.
And it gave her like this sense of purpose that they were like saving when there was nothing else left, they could bring back their beliefs and their traditions. I just thought that was a very interesting way. And Alma lets her keep that community by killing her dad for her.
Yeah. I mean, and he seemed like he was bringing clearly another partner that he was involved in and had a child with, and yeah, we don't need his. So it's like that movie. The movie I know it ends with us. It's like Amma will close the cycle off for us. So there's no more abuse. There's not this particular abusive guy in the story. It's what was it? And it also it's this kind of maybe this larger idea. And I don't know if anybody's ever like articulated it to me or I just came up with it. I'm pretty sure I heard it from somewhere else. This idea that, with indigenous people and native peoples in the Americas that the colonization of white, but that's just a period that will come and eventually go, or that kind of hope that there will be, after this zombie apocalypse again, an apocalypse that thinking with the European diseases like smallpox that just clearly decimated. I mean, we're talking 10, 20, 30. It decimated a significant portion of North America. I don't, there were obviously some overt attempts to do it, but the amount of death that happened, just how people, explorers, colonizers, there's just an empty village here. We don't know where anybody went. I mean, I think it's that and the Black Death are clearly the two worst kind of plagues we've ever dealt with. Sure. But yeah, this sense of this interregnum, it's like now we'll go back to living our lives.
It almost seemed like a reward for holding on to those customs and traditions. They were already set up to survive in that kind of isolation.
Yeah.
They had what they had learned from their past, and because they had learned from their past, they were able to rebuild when other people weren't. Yeah,
and because they've been kind of cast around, moving around a lot. The drive-in is a place of stability,
sure,
and adaptation. It's not, because I always think about like drive-ins as being they're kind of useless when they're not in operation. But if you can, it's good space if you can find a way to use it. So they're using it as a community space and not just it's nighttime. Here's a horror film. So
yeah, absolutely. And then the last story that I specifically want to talk about was the snowy one.
Yeah.
I'm a big snow fan as well as zombie fan.
We'll be talking about some snow stuff in a couple of episodes, I believe.
I think we will.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
The Shining, absolutely. I forgot that is coming up. Funny enough. But I was interested, we were talking about the most realistic, and I was wondering what you thought. Is this the ghost cousin? Or is this the hallucination from the carbon monoxide?
I mean,
that saves the sister. I don't know if the sister ended up dying and then the one lived, or if they both survived. I didn't know exactly what happened there. But yeah, I was wondering, do you think this is a ghost that saved them, or do you think that this was
a hallucination?
Yeah.
I mean,
she was thinking of her cousin as she sits in the car.
I mean, I suppose there's a certain plausible deniability. It leaves it up a little bit ambiguous to where it could be both. But if we're dealing with supernatural stories, we'll just say it's a ghost. I hate to be kind of, Mr. Agreeable about this, but I just thought another thing thinking about what's terrifying. This is a relatively short story.
Yeah.
In the book is just this takes place in 1979. This is when the story takes place, 1979, and they're just a lot of things bad that happened that led to those two girls trying to stay warm.
I really felt like this was a story about how greater structures have let down indigenous children.
Just basic things like the library being open. And if the library, was open, if the neighbor was there, if they were able, just to be more mindful about, hey, their parents can't get off work. And it just shows these little things that lead to tragedies.
Yeah. And the little failures, the things that fall through the cracks that end up making huge impacts. So I really, it's short, but not only was it snowy, which I love, but yeah, it brought up those systematic issues that are so easy to not think about.
Yeah.
Because they just, especially as people who don't have children. I know my library is closed. I'm like, yes, I get to stay home and enjoy the snow.
Yeah.
But this book makes me think, who needed my library to be open today?
Yeah.
When you're in a public service position, sometimes it's not about what you want. And so I really enjoyed this one.
Yeah, and also it's also just the huge problem of it's these I remember like growing up in Georgia, like if it snowed overnight, that's no problem because everybody's supposed to be in bed and everything, and then they wake up. But if it happens like during the afternoon or during rush hour, that's when all hell breaks. That's when all hell breaks loose, and just bad things happen. It's just And it is like it places in the South, it's pitiful. It's pitiful how bad they cannot handle any sort of snow. They don't have the salt trucks. Of course, I lived in other places farther north, and they don't have the, the stuff. You're kind of on your own, and you're thinking when you hit the brakes and it's all icy, like maybe I hit something, maybe I don't.
Been there.
But yeah, and it's just, yeah, just I think nowadays people have been a little more aware of like, well, let's just play it safe, okay, okay.
But I also thought that they did a great job. While I was reading this, I was thinking about my school days when they would send us, but then we would hear that we were going home before even lunch. And so you had like that excited chatter. Like I felt like she captured that feeling perfectly. And even, as much of a Halloween girl as I am, it made me want snowy season real bad.
We had some Halloween and a snowy season. Yeah. I remember one time, this is weird, like we went to school, and I was in 4th or 5th grade, and literally everyone's like showing me, look, and the water was out. They would try to press the water fountain, and like eventually we're gonna go home, and it was like 3rd or 4th period before we finally went home, and then the local news station had us, and I think I'm in the background as this really tall kid because with the tall kid, and getting on the bus or something like that. But it was like, hey, we didn't have water. We didn't have water for 3 or 4 hours, and you still put us in school.
I think that the few times we were sent to school when it was expected to get snowy, from my understanding, at least my area, it was for kids who wouldn't eat another time until we came back. So they would bring us in so they could at least feed them some type of breakfast or lunch before sending them back out. So in that way, I love that part of community about Appalachia.
Yeah.
I don't know if other places are like that, but Appalachia, that was definitely something on their minds.
I do know I had a friend that he had a child when they lived in he had a daughter, and this was when he was living in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I believe he said they let him play outside as long as it's minus 20 or under. They'll let him play outside. So they're like pretty hardy. If you're living in Alaska and going through a winter in Alaska, you're pretty hardy. But yeah, that's they're living with that several months out of the year, and everybody else is not very well equipped to handle it.
For sure. I would love to have an Alaskan winter where I don't have to do anything except stay inside.
Yeah, you got everything. You spent all the summer and the fall collecting everything that you need to survive. So. Yep. Yeah, I was kind of curious about, I think there's something that feels kind of, I think particularly some of the stories, they have a kind of 50s feel to them, aliens, monsters, that has that kind of appeal to it. And I wondered how you felt about anything like that. I mean, as far as like, it seems, because we have some of the earlier stories, I think there's one, I think the second story is a very, it's an epistolary, so it's got this whole, something you'd expect out of like Nathaniel Hawthorne or somebody like that. And then things that are in the 50s or 60s feel very much of those times. I don't know, where you're feeling about the tone and the different settings.
For me, like I said, at the beginning of this book, I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? But I also don't like things in like that old Western setting. So starting it there for me was already like okay, we're going to see how this goes.
I was like, I'm ready. Let's go.
So the later we got, the more excited I got. Because I'm also, right now, I don't know if we've talked about this, I'm very into Americana and the West, especially in like that 50s to 70s road trip era. So that's for me is when the book started getting really good. Is when I got to read about like the 50s and the 60s. And I wanted more of those 50s. I was so sad they skipped the entire 50s. We go from like 68 to 70 something. Yeah. And I was like, no, I wanted a 50s story. But no, yeah, I loved when they would pick that up. And then we got even further, and I was like, oh, hey, this is my childhood that we're discussing now.
Yeah. I think it was the one story, American Predators, which I guess is kind of like it's some sort of like it's a story about. Is this the one about the two guys that? Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, this is about Billy and Whit, and they're like these hokey like traveling show. They like do like little news pieces or whatever, and there's the Darla, the character who is lesbian and has to like work with these two kind of annoying, sort of racist guys, and then they all get eaten by a werewolf.
Love that. I loved the story, An Attack on No Man's Land. It was the one about the man who was on the front lines of a war.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like bunkering down. He's like, oh my God, a wolf's out to get me.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day, his sergeant's like getting the hand that the guy stabbed. And then there's never been a record of the sergeant. I just loved that ending.
Yeah, I mean, it's something when we did. I think it feels like it's a bit more fleshed out. But when we did the ghost stories, kind of with Ruth Ann music that she had collected, it feels something like a folktale kind of thing, like a horror of World War I kind of experience.
For me, it felt like a story you'd tell around the campfire.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was no record of the sergeant, and I just really enjoyed that ending. And like I said, those little short ones were absolutely the easiest for me to just fly through.
Yeah. So it made me think about. I mean, there's also romance in this one. So it's one called Me and the Monster. It's the one I wanted to touch on. So it's a character, Gina Wilson, and she has something of a relationship with a goat man out at the lake.
Can I point out also that in the family tree, she had a kid but was never married.
Oh.
The goat man was the love of her life.
Yeah. Oh, maybe, yeah. I hadn't thought about it. Sometimes, I will say sometimes with the thing, it's like you want to get as much out of the story, and then I find it a little disorienting. That would be one thing, is like going back and forth with the family tree and seeing
and
where
the
people...
glossary.
Yeah, which I don't mind using the Cherokee words, keeping that alive. Yeah, and that's a little bit, okay, which one was which? And you start to learn a little bit, but it is a lot of going back and forth.
See, I felt a lot of irritation, especially in that first, before we get into this one, while we're on the subject, especially in that first story. It wasn't even the Cherokee. It was the German. I've had enough Spanish that I could like parse out what was almost being said, but the German, and then I was like, how irritated am I? Imagine these people coming onto your land and telling you to leave in a language you don't understand.
Yeah.
So am I really going to be a crybaby?
Yeah.
And so, I kind of had that epiphany.
It's a little work, yeah.
Like,
Suck it up. Suck it up, reader.
Literally, you're fine.
Yeah.
Imagine if these people came onto your land and were going to kill you if you didn't respond to a language that you have no explanation for.
Yeah.
So, the more I thought about it, the more I was okay, even though I was frustrated.
Yeah, and I think, it is a way you can figure it out after a while.
There's context clues, even in that first chapter of kind of what's happening.
Yeah. And there's even the one story where they mix like Clockwork Orange language and Cherokee language in different places.
Yes.
And that was okay, one's made up, and then the other one is foundational to a people.
I wish I had the family tree printed out in front of me while I was reading.
Like almost like I need to like print it out. If I just had a.
If you want to read this book, print the family tree out separately so you can kind of refer to it as you're reading. Yeah. Because there are a lot of interesting secrets that the stories don't tell you, but the family tree does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say if you want to print out the glossary too, that's not too bad. And hey, you can learn new words that way.
Yeah.
And this is a wonderful looking and Jeff Edwards did the illustrations for. I think it's a very nice looking book in a world where, print on demand, they don't, they're not the most excitingly designed book, but it's just the front cover, the book, the inside. It's a very nice book. Hey, Christmas is coming up. If you have somebody who likes horror stories.
So I read the ebook, and just looking at your physical copy, get the physical copy. Yeah. It does so much more for the illustrations than the ebook does. They're in there, but not as beautifully as this.
Yeah, it's worth paying a little extra for this.
I didn't even know that there were black pages in the book until I was reading a review about it.
Yeah, and there's a story about a ghost cat, which I'm all about, and
so
it's
cute.
A really nice ghost cat picture for that. So anyway, yes, to get the book, it's worth it to get the hardcover. So.
But back to Goatman and
Goatman.
romance.
So yeah, I'm always interested in these stories. I don't know how you feel. I mean, obviously, like we're like it's these kind of stories where they're obviously metaphorical, they're obviously figurative, but ultimately what it is, and so maybe a little expletive language here, but they ultimately come down to, hey, this is a story where we root for a woman to fuck a monster.
Yep, agreed. Because he's not the real monster in the story.
Yeah.
It's the man that pushed her to the goat man
Mhm.
that is the monster. And I think that's the point they're making, not telling you to go commit bestiality
Yeah.
because someone's mean to you.
Yeah.
Don't
Don't do that.
In this fictional world where a goat man exists, who is a very nice, gentlemanly goat man.
And I assume he is able, even though he is a goat man, he's able to consent. So we don't see anything like that. There's no, I'm just reading slightly under the subtext of like clearly, she's fallen in love with the goat man and wants to have a relationship with him.
It turns out if you're in the woods and you have to choose between goat man and the man, go for the goat man.
Yeah. I also like wonder it's going back to stories like Beauty and the Beast, is like, hello lady, hello ladies. There's some awful guys out there, and there may be a guy who's a monster and he's gross and scary, but you'll get used to him at some point and you'll accept that, and yeah, you can marry him or have a relationship with it. It always is, and I've seen a few stories where it's like the woman's like, no, I'm not interested in having a relationship with a monster. I mean, I like the monster, but I don't like him that way. So I think it's interesting that this is kind of embodies that this is even like figuratively and metaphorically, you have to learn to fall for the goat man. And she kind of, it's a very short story, but you see her kind of trying to help the goat man, trying to help
him,
give him some pants. She's very sad because she's going off to college and long distance relationships don't work. And she's feeding him, and he just seems like a good guy, and he's out there in the woods, sad, out by the lake. So I feel bad. I feel bad for the goat man.
Do you think that her son is part goat?
I mean, which one was her son?
Ben. Riley and Laura were her grandchildren.
Okay.
So their dad, I'm assuming.
I don't know.
It's goat.
The goat man. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I can't remember if there's any sort of goat-like behavior.
Because she is also, I think, the only one on this family tree. No, Billy Spears. So there's two of them on this family tree that they have children, but no significant other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think one of the Spears was one of the werewolves.
Mm-hmm.
So I like trying to find those kind of connections. Yeah. Like I said, I found that review that said I want to study this next time instead of reading it for enjoyment, and I was like, yeah, I wonder what you could parse out.
If you parse out. I still think it's a very enjoyable book just to read on its own. I mean, it has that myth, it has the horror elements. I generally think it's quite a mixing together of things you would recognize and things you wouldn't recognize if you were, the normal average reader who's not that familiar with any sort of Cherokee legends or Native American legends. Although you should be at least aware of some of these things.
I was shocked that one of the reviews said that you needed to come in with a lot of pre-knowledge, and I was like, I didn't come in with hardly any. I came in with pop culture references.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it helps some, but I don't think it allows you to see things in a certain way, but I don't think it hurts your experience of the book. I think there's a really kind of wonderful tierceness in the writing, and it really Rogers is really good. Just like say something, just make you really sad. I have a lot of frowny faces in a good way. I have a lot of frowny faces because I like to mark up my books. And there's a lot of frowny faces throughout this. It's like, that's sad, that's sad, that's sad. But in a cathartic kind of way. So, yeah.
Honestly, I wasn't sure how I felt about this book at all, period. I even emailed you and I was like, please lead this discussion because I am And then I got to those last two stories, and I felt like the whole book just clicked at that moment.
It has its challenges, I think, but I think they're challenges that are that's worth the effort
It
to go
pays
through
off
them.
in the
Yeah,
end, I felt.
yeah, and I think there's a lot of tonal change because she's whatever the style is or the decades, like certainly the 19th century stuff is very much tries to echo that kind of style and quality of diaries or something Nathaniel Hawthorne might have written. And I like what what she's trying to do there, and I think it's quite effective. And then I think it kind of I think generally it was always what I remember hearing about like William Faulkner novels is like he always will give you the hardest stuff first, and then he'll get a little easier as he goes along. So I think it naturally lends itself to. I think some of the later stories are some of the more emotional stories. I think you feel more connected to them.
Yeah. Yes. Like I said, but almost all of these stories had some type of dead parent.
Yeah,
Not all of them.
There's a lot of dead parents in this one.
A lot of dead parents.
Very, very fairy tale like. Very, very. That's certainly a thing that's running through a lot of these stories. So, I would recommend it. I know we've got Native American Heritage Month coming up, and this is certainly a good book to read for that. And something around the Halloween season or just like scary stuff. I guess the scary I wasn't really, but I always think like reading horror as we've read, and I've read more horror. A lot of disturbing stuff. I don't necessarily think, oh no, I'm afraid to go to bed. But it's like, man, that's pretty messed up.
I feel the same way about horror movies now.
Mhm.
I love them. I love them so much. But I can't tell you the last time I saw a horror movie that made me scared.
You've become one with the shadows.
Yeah. Unsettled, maybe.
Yeah.
Disturbed.
That's weird.
But I'm not having nightmares.
Yeah. You've just watched enough and read enough horror that you can appreciate it.
Except zombies. I have nightmares about
Oh,
zombies.
really? Oh, yeah.
That's why I think they're my favorite.
Mhm.
Because there's still something terrifying about them.
Yeah. They're very nasty. So.
So I think I want to, if you're okay, want to end it with a little quote
Sure, yeah.
from the end
Knock
of
us
the
out.
water one to show that some of these stories do end with a lot of hope. Before taking the escape pod below the waves, I looked back once more at the people who saved me. If there were more people who cared, who believed in the rights of all living beings, maybe the planet could be saved. And I just want to leave it on that little bit of hopeful note for the future.